The time is at hand.
From the city of crackheads in Williamson, West Virginia, just on the south side of town, in the parking lot of my job, you're in dark places. Well, my bad luck streak continues. I have had to replace a water heater since I last talked to you, and that was fun. On November 3rd, we lost our cat Mickey. I don't really know what happened. He had the ear infection that I talked about on a previous episode, and he got some medicine for it, and he was doing great. He was acting better than he had in years. It's really weird. Brandon just found him dead. Kind of think he had a heart attack, I don't know. And that's all I gotta say about that. But, how was your Halloween? Did you get lots of treats? See any scary creatures? My Halloween was spent mostly messing with that water heater, so I had no fun at all. But I guess that happens. This week on the show, probably the final part of the Vampire Trilogy, Part 3. That's a trilogy, right? The first vampire episode was on episode 51, way back there. And then part 2 was on 221. So, anyone interested in that? This is Vampires Part 3. And I probably mentioned this on one of the other ones, but we just came off Halloween. So, when I was a kid, I used to almost always dress up like a vampire. I remember being a vampire like probably 5 times. Love vampires. We're going to talk about vampires this week. One more time. The Rise of Count Dracula. Dracula, the most famous vampire of them all, was created as the anti-hero of a novel written in 1897. Yet, as Daniel Farson shows, thanks Daniel, the truth about the blood-sucking aristocrat is far stranger than fiction. The cult of the vampire in the 20th century is very largely due to books and films based on one larger-than-life character, Count Dracula. Created in 1897 by the Irish-born theater manager Bram Stoker, Dracula, from the book of the same name, has become synonymous with vampirism, indeed popularizing it. It is ironic that Jack the Ripper, who committed real atrocities about the same time as the publication of Dracula, should have become part of our folklore, whereas many people today believe that Dracula was a real person. In one respect, in fact, they are right. But the fictional Dracula was a complex creation. While the young Bram Stoker was making his way in the world, a fellow Dubliner, Sheridan Le Fanu, was making money out of vampirism. His Carmilla, published in 1872, was a sensation. The average Victorian reader almost certainly did not perceive what is today the overt lesbianism of the book, but it still made an enormous impression on its readers. Echoes of its dreadful, awe-inspiring climax can be found in Dracula, but the end of the undead, Carmilla, as told by Le Fanu, is strongly reminiscent of the case histories of alleged vampires recorded in such horrific abundance in Eastern Europe. The combination of necrophilia, seduction of virgins from beyond the grave, and an atmosphere of violence made vampirism very popular. After all, the wicked creature was always destroyed in the end, so it must be a moral tale. The scene had been set for over 30 years before Victoria came to the throne. Lord Byron, accompanied by his doctor, Polidori, spent the summer of 1816 on the shores of Lake Geneva in Switzerland, conveniently close to their friends, the poet Shelley and his mistress, Mary Godwin, who later became his wife. The weather was bad, so they amused themselves by staying indoors and writing ghost stories. It was to be a remarkably productive way of passing the time. For Mary Godwin, inspired no doubt by the lengthy talk of ghosts and ghouls and the tempestuous elements, dreamed the entire story that she duly wrote down and called Frankenstein. Polidori, at first loath to enter into competition with his literary masters, eventually produced a long story called The Vampire, which he proceeded to publish, hinting heavily that it was, in fact, written by Byron. Polidori's tale was a sensation. Professor Leonard Wolff claims in his book, The Annotated Dracula, that Polidori gave us the prototype vampire. That is to say, as a nobleman, aloof, brilliant, chilling, fascinating to women, and coolly evil. Polidori's vampire was the forerunner of the legion of vampires who began to invade English literature, such as Varney the Vampire or The Feast of Blood by James Malcolm Rymer, author of many bestsellers, often published anonymously. Varney appeared in 220 weekly parts in a pulp magazine and was as popular as the most successful television soap opera today. Do soap operas still exist? I think those are kind of done now, ain't they? I don't know. There might be a couple left. Drop me a comment, let me know. With this sort of background, Stoker began to write what was to become the vampire classic. It was his idea to bring the vampire novel up to date, setting Dracula in the late 19th century England, even including references to such innovations as Kodak photographs and a dictaphone. And although the Count originated from Transylvania, his London address was Piccadilly. Count Dracula is a complex literary creation. His background, the wild, sinister country of what is now Romania, may seem like poetic fiction, and indeed should be, for Stoker never visited the country himself. Instead, he consulted on an old guidebook and spent many hours talking with a colorful Hungarian professor, Artemis Vanbury. The result was that the country of Dracula's origin was described with uncanny detail. A modern visitor to the Borgo Pass, which is mentioned by name in the novel, needs no stretch of the imagination to fit fiction to fact. But Vanbury did more than leave Stoker with a vivid impression of topography. He told him tales of Transylvania vampires and enduring vampire superstition. And he also told him of the 15th century Transylvanian prince, Vlad, whose extreme sadism and bloodlust had earned him a special place in Transylvanian history. He had another name, Dracula. This has two meanings. His father was called Dracul, so Dracula may well be simply the son of Dracul. The other meaning is dragon. It may be, given his perverted exploits, that the two meanings became inextricably linked, for the son of Dracul was indeed a dragon. His favorite pastime was impaling prisoners, or indeed anyone, on high-pointed poles. Impaling was to him a fine art and meant a slow death for his victims. He particularly enjoyed having his meal set out on the table under the forest of mass impalings, where he would invite others to join him. But Vlad Dracula was and is known to Romanians as a hero, for he rid them of their enemies, the Turks. It is said that in so doing, he impaled 30,000 Turks in one day. The fictional Dracula says, "One of my own race, who crossed the Danube and beat the Turk on his own ground." This was a Dracula indeed. This and other features of the story seem to prove the contention that the Count was based almost entirely on the historical warrior. But although undoubtedly bloodthirsty, even by the standards of the time, Vlad Dracula was not a vampire. As far as anyone knows, he never actually drank blood, and despite some rumors, generated, one suspects mainly by the tourist industry, he has never risen from his grave. In fact, no one is sure where it is. It may be, however, that Professor Vanbury also told Stoker of a distant descendant of Vlad Dracula, whose burial was decidedly vampiristic. The 15th century Countess Elizabeth Bathory had a penchant for kidnapping village girls and milking them with her blood in various slow and agonizing ways. The object of this unpleasant exercise was to bathe in it, in order to maintain her alleged beauty. She was probably the inspiration for the Countess in Le Fanu's Carmilla, and certainly was for Mark Ronson's Bloodthirst of 1980. Other blood-obsessed historical figures have included the notorious Giles de Reyes, one-time patron of Joan of Arc. His particular passion was the torturing of little boys, finally dispatching them by ordering his servants to split their jugular veins so that their blood would spurt over him. And nearer our own time was the acid bath murderer, John George High, who was also known as the Vampire Killer. High is said to have killed a young man named Swan, among others, so he could collect his blood, a wineglass full, and drink it. Basil Cooper, in his The Vampire, 1971, claims that High was a vampire in the classical tradition, possibly the only true monster in this field in the 20th century. By this, of course, I do not mean that he was a vampire in the supernatural sense, but there is at least a strong suggestion that he needed to drink blood in order to refresh and sustain himself. High was hanged in 1949. The reservation about vampires in the supernatural sense is vital. None of these perverts actually rose from the dead. A little harsh. Some enjoyed the sight, feel, and occasionally the taste of human blood. Vampires all around. However, just as the Aztecs and Indian Rajas drank blood believing that it would give them strength, so it seems there are quite ordinary people who, by design or by accident, drain people surrounding them of their life force or energy. This phenomenon is extremely common. We all know someone who seems to feed on the energy of others, leaving them drained and tired. Yes, a few of those guys at work. This so-called psychic vampirism is a recurring theme in occult writings, but one of its least controversial aspects is the preying of men on women, or vice versa, in ways often remarkably similar to those lovingly detailed in Carmilla and Dracula. Normal, decent folk who would ordinarily find tales of corpses running blood off-putting find themselves enjoying vampire stories, perhaps against their will, just as the prim and proper Victorians did. Why? What is this extraordinary hold of vampirism on the subconscious minds of most people? Of all the on-screen Draculas, since the Count's debut in 1931, when he was played by the Hungarian Bela Lugosi, no one actor has been so closely identified with the great vampire as the British actor Christopher Lee, who explained the appeal of the character by saying, he offers the illusion of immortality, the subconscious wish we all have of limitless power. A man of tremendous brain and physical strength. He is either a reincarnation or he has never died. He is a Superman image with erotic appeal for women who find him totally alluring. In many ways, he is everything people would like to be. The anti-hero, the heroic villain. For women, there is the complete abandonment to the power of a man. And although American horror film star Vincent Price has never actually played a vampire, except in the spoof The Master Club of 1980, almost everyone thinks he has. Maybe that's a Mandela effect. Price says, often when I'm walking along in the street, a middle-aged matron comes up to me and says, "Please bite me." The virgin's ecstatic swoon, half fear, half pleasurable excitement, as the superhuman figure in the swirling black cape materializes in her bedroom. The oppressive, languorous feeling, the total abandonment, the pleasure and the pain of the vampire's teeth sinking into her neck while she cannot move or cry out. All this can be seen clearly as a romanticization of seduction and defloration, with the added thrill of the supernatural. In Victorian days, decent girls were ruined by seduction. But what if their seducer were a demon from beyond the grave? Then the more innocent the victim, the greater her excuse, and the greater her attraction for the vampire. The excitement of vampirism was made explicit in a painting by Philip Burne-Jones called The Vampire, exhibited in 1897, the same year as the publication of Stoker's Dracula. London society flocked to see it. It portrayed a voluptuous woman bending over a man whose chest is bare, and there is blood trickling from the punctures made by her teeth on his skin. The catalog to the exhibition contained a poem by the young Rudyard Kipling, opening with the line, "A fool there was." When the painting and the catalog appeared in New York, they made such a profound impression that within months a play opened on Broadway entitled "A Fool There Was." This in turn led to a film of the same name, launching one Theodosia Goodman, or as she is more popularly known, Theda Bara, an anagram of Arab death, as one of the film stars. Despite her real-life ordinariness, the film Mongols decided to cast her in the image of a female predator, showing her in one scene crouching triumphantly over a male skeleton and treating all men with superior scorn. She was given the line, or rather the subtitle, for this was in the days of silent screen, "Kiss me, my fool," which became all the rage. And perhaps most significantly, her type became known as female vamp, short for vampire. As the 20th century progresses, perverted violence and all manner of horrors are taken as a matter of course. Yet the odd fact remains that many people are fascinated by the idea of vampirism. In the early 1970s, the British Dracula Society was formed, and there are Count Dracula appreciation societies in several parts of the United States and other countries. The Romanian tourist industry is booming, thanks to the confusion in many people's minds between the real and the fictional Draculas. If anything, the fascination seems to be increasing. Why? Perhaps it is a curious blend of explicit and implicit, of surrender, of possession, of the promise of immortality, of being Superman and women in the atmosphere of thrilling evil. As one film producer said to the Dracula Society, "Supernatural never fails." The upright and very Victorian Bram Stoker would have been horrified to discover what the post-Freud world made of his masterpiece. But it seems hard to ignore the connotations, subliminal though they may be, in his story. Take the passage where Jonathan Harker is surrounded and caressed by vampire women in Castle Dracula. The fair girl went on her knees and bent over me, fairly gloating. There was a deliberate voluptuousness which was both thrilling and repulsive, and as she arched her neck, she actually licked her lips like an animal, till I could see in the moonlight the moisture shining on the scarlet lips and on the red tongue as it lapped the sharp red teeth. Lower and lower went her head. I closed my eyes, ecstasy, and waited. Vampires, myth and reality. Count Dracula continues to hold his audience in a state of horrified half-belief. But whatever the truth of the vampire legend, its roots can be traced to a number of simple facts, as Daniel Farson explains. Thanks, Daniel. At the end of the first stage version of Dracula in 1924, the actor Hamilton Dean, who played the part of Van Helsing, appeared before the curtain with a little reassurance for the audience. Just a moment, ladies and gentlemen. Just a word before you leave. We hope the memories of Dracula won't give you bad dreams. So just a word of reassurance. When you get home tonight and the lights have been turned out and you are afraid to look behind the curtains and you dread to see a face appear at the window, why, pull yourself together and remember that, after all, there are such things. It was a perfect exit line. The audience, primed to a fine degree by a background of vampire books, had spent the evening thrilling to the extraordinarily compelling tale of the greatest vampire of them all, Dracula. His creator, the theater manager, Bram Stoker, knew instinctively that his story struck some chord deep in the collective subconscious of his audience. Dracula was both a bestseller and a box office success. That meant that it had mass appeal, and the tale of the vampire count still has. As actor Christopher Lee explained, Dracula appeals partly because he is a superhuman figure, an immortal, whose chilling presence is also irresistible. Psychologists point to the clear difference between the sadistic, dominant vampire and a masochistic or superviolent victim. But whatever the jargon used, Dracula is more fascinating than the atavistic werewolf, who is, after all, at least half animal, and certainly not an aristocrat or a shadowy ghost. But the vampire is not to be considered on par with the creature from the Black Lagoon or Doctor Who's enemies, the Daleks, whereas the others can be dismissed as mere stagecraft, thrilling enough during the performance but forgotten soon after. The vampire is to be taken seriously. There are masses of documents of Eastern Europe in the 18th century attesting to the reality of the undead. So, are there such things? As in many other aspects of the paranormal, all possible rational explanations must be thoroughly exhausted before a supernatural explanation can even be considered. And in the case of the vampire epidemic of 200 years ago, there are several such rational explanations to choose from. For example, the popular occult writer Dennis Wheatley has pointed out that in past times of great deprivation, beggars broke into graveyards and slept in the shelter of the mausoleums by day, emerging at night to forage for food, thin, pale, and seen leaving tombs under the cover of darkness. They were perhaps not unnaturally taken to be legendary and terrifying vampires. However, the mistaken identity of relatively few human scavengers does not explain those cases of corpses found to be incorrupt when their coffins were opened. This is a rare, but by no means unknown phenomenon, and various natural explanations have been suggested as the cause of it. Certainly the soil in which the body is buried can make an astonishing difference to the rate at which it decomposes. On the volcanic island of Santorini, Greece, for example, corpses are found so intact after a great number of years that local people have a saying, "Send a vampire to Santorini," just as the British might speak of sending coals to Newcastle. But by far the most convincing of the rational explanations is that of premature burial. Not all cataleptics were as fortunate as the Irish soldier in the early 1800s, who came back to life when being roughly handled prior to his burial. Coma, catalepsy, and other death-like states are barely understood by the modern world, let alone by the superstitious peasants from the land beyond the forests in times gone by. How many poor wretches awoke to discover themselves immured in a coffin with the heavy earth pressing down on them, or perhaps, having successfully fought their way out of the coffin, found themselves locked in the family mausoleum, there to die of hunger, thirst, and horror. Terror beyond the grave. Premature burial was common. It is said that when an 18th century English graveyard was being demolished to make way for a car park, a third of the corpses turned up by the bulldozer showed signs of having struggled while in their coffins. The evidence included broken fingers from scratching the coffin lid in their final death agony, even hands protruding from the coffin, and blood upon the shroud where the corpse had bitten his or her own flesh as suffocation or madness took its toll. And it was the presence of blood on an exhumed corpse that was frequently considered proof that the dead person was a vampire. But if the newly dead was rumored to be vampire, perhaps feeble sounds may have been heard emanating from the grave. Then the terrified witnesses would take their time-honored measures against it. And if the corpse's heart was beating, that was, to them, a sure sign that it must be staked. No wonder there are so many accounts of alleged vampires screaming as a stake was plunged into their living hearts. Charlotte Stoker used to tell the young Bram a grisly bedtime story concerning a local victim of cholera epidemic. The woman, believed dead, was thrown on the heap of corpses in the lime pit. However, her grief-stricken husband, who went to recover her body and give her a decent burial, discovered she was still breathing. She lived on happily for many years after that appalling experience. But supposing she had recovered by herself and had been seen staggering out of the pit at night, it would have been easy to mistake her for one of the undead. From time to time, modern newspapers carry stories about people certified dead coming to life on a marble slab in the morgue or when being prepared for burial. In these days of spare part surgery, the controversy rages over the exact moment and, indeed, the true nature of death more than at any point in history. But the Victorians were at least aware of the possibility of premature burial. Some even became obsessed with the idea. Edgar Allan Poe based several of his stories on the theme, and in both the United States and Europe, various patents were taken out of coffins with alarm bells or emergency air supplies incorporated into their design. Premature burial may often have arisen because the various steps of rigor mortis are commonly misunderstood. The muscles of a corpse start to go rigid beginning in the face and neck about an hour and a half after death. This may set in sooner or later, depending on the temperature of the surroundings. Rigor mortis passes roughly 36 hours later. The muscles lose their extreme rigidity and the body becomes relatively pliable. This could well be the explanation for the vampire story told to the author in 1974 in the valley of Curtea de Iarga, Romania. The speaker was a handsome gypsy woman, who described, through an interpreter, the shock of her family when they came to lay out her father's body for burial, for the limbs were pliable, not rigid. This news raced to the village, a village where this could mean only one thing. The old man had become a vampire. The stake was dully plunged through his heart, and the villagers were satisfied and relieved. But perhaps, if this was not simply a case of rigor mortis passing off prematurely, the old man was still alive. There is even a logical explanation for the widespread use of garlic as a vampire repellent. Plague was frequently carried by flies, and it was noticed that certain farms were spared if they hung out garlic. There was no magic involved. Garlic bulbs exude drops of moisture that flies detest. Garlic, when eaten, is also believed to be a natural antiseptic, a blood purifier, and vampires were always a useful scapegoat in certain rural communities if animals weakened and died. These days, the vet would no doubt administer a dose of antibiotics or special vitamin supplement, and all would be well, in most cases. However, mysterious sicknesses and mutilations of cattle and other animals do occur, but hostile UFO knots are now the fashionable culprits. Demonic bloodsuckers. There may be logical, even mundane explanations for 99 out of 100 cases of alleged vampirism, but it is the 100th case that sets the researcher wondering. For many years, occultists have believed in the existence of demonic blood-sucking materializations. One, the practicing occultist, Dion Fortune, whose real name was Vincent Firth, believed that the astral body can escape from a person's living body and assume another form, such as a bird, animal, or vampire. Dion Fortune also cited the case of dead Hungarian soldiers who became vampires during the First World War, maintaining themselves in the etheric double, that is, halfway between this world and the next, or earthbound, by vampirizing the wounded. Vampirism is believed to be contagious. The person who is vampirized, being depleted of vitality, is thought to be a psychic vacuum, himself absorbing the life force from anyone who falls prey to him. Cynical research, on the other hand, deals not with beliefs, but with observed facts. One of the most common of the phenomena investigated by the SPR, for example, is that of the poltergeist, and an allied phenomenon seems to be that of the invisible attacker, such as the Reverend Neil Smith described. Raised scratch marks appear on the face of poltergeist victim Eleanor Zungen of Romania during 1926, and in 1960 a certain Jimmy de Bruin, a 20-year-old farm worker in South Africa, became the focus for a spat of poltergeist activity. On one occasion, an investigating police officer heard de Bruin scream with agony as cuts spontaneously appeared on his legs and chest. Other areas of the paranormal also involve the spontaneous appearance of wounds or blood, such as images that bleed and stigmata. These, however, are commonly accepted as holy phenomena, whereas vampirism is widely believed to be of the devil. It may indeed be true that these phenomena are opposite sides of the same coin, one good and the other evil, but perhaps all unexplained phenomena emanate from the same source, being neither moral nor immoral, just unusual. But until we discover what it is, we can continue to thrill to the latest vampire tale and ponder on the question, are there such things? The Terror of Croglan Grange. The macabre story of a shriveled, bony creature that attacked a young woman by night suggested that a fiend with a lust for blood was loose in Victorian England. Colin Godman examines the tale of the Croglan vampire. Thanks, Colin. Apart from medieval legends of the vampire, the British Isles have been curiously free of that particular plague. Free, that is, until 1900, when Augustus Harris' tale of vampirism in Cumberland, now Cumbria, was first published. Many writers have quoted it, but few have attempted to trace the creature to its lair. The trail left by Hare has proved difficult to follow. The Vampire of Croglan Grange makes its appearance in the 4th volume of Hare's autobiography, The Story of My Life. The book is a rambling series of anecdotes, tall stories, and excerpts from his journal. The vampire story had originated with Captain Fisher, who said his ancestors had once lie in bed gazing out at the moonlit lawn beyond her window. One night she saw a creature dart from the shadows. In a moment it was at her window, scratching at the glass. The window was shut fast, but the figure began picking away at the lid. A pane of glass was loosened and fell into the room. A long, bony finger released the catch, and the creature was in the room, twisting its shriveled fingers through her hair. It dragged her toward it, and then bit her on the throat. The woman's screams alerted her brothers, who chased the vampire out of the house, across the lawn, and over the neighboring churchyard wall. Although the woman's wound was to heal in time, her doctor urged.
I've got the urge. She's got the urge to purple. She ran the river in the shower.
A change of scene. The siblings decided to holiday in Switzerland. When the young woman had recovered, the threesome returned to Croglan, and the following winter passed without event. Then one night in March, the young woman was woken by scratching at her window. The creature was there again. This time her screams brought her brothers running to the rescue armed with pistols. In the ensuing melee, the creature was hit in the leg, but despite this, it managed to evade capture. However, the men did see where it went to ground, in an old family vault in the churchyard. The following day, the local villagers opened the vault and found a horrible scene of broken coffins and mangled corpses. Only one coffin stood intact. When the lid was prized open, there, brown, shriveled, mummified, but quite entire, was the same hideous figure which had looked in the windows of Croglan Grange, with the marks of a recent pistol shot in the leg. And they did the only thing that can lay a vampire. They burned it. This is how Augustus Hare concluded his account of Captain Fisher's narrative. England had acquired its first authenticated vampire, and the story was soon being included in anthologies of British hauntings. Augustus Hare and Captain Edward Fisher had first met in June 1874, on the eve of the latter's marriage to Hare's cousin, Lady Victoria Little. At dinner, Hare, a renowned raconteur, told alarming ghost stories that he had collected during his wide travels in Europe. Fisher seemed compelled to relate a story of his own. He began by telling the assembled company that his family had not always lived at Thorncombe, near Guildford. Then must have followed the vampire tale, much as Hare related in his autobiography. Hare was proud of his memory and the mass of detail he invariably included in his writings. Indeed, to his publisher's despair, he refused to cut any of his material. Only a little is known of Fisher's later life. Following his marriage in July, he made his home in Thorncombe, an elegant estate 5 miles from Guildford, where he continued to charm Hare as one of the kindest, cheeriest, pleasantest fellows who ever entered a family. Fisher, whose full name and title were Edward Roe Fisher Roe, later captain of the 4th Dragoon Guards, was to die at Thorncombe on his 77th birthday, on November 8th, 1909. His wife lies by his side in Holy Trinity Church at Bramley. She died in 1935. What of Fisher's ancestors? Did they really own Croglan Grange? 12 miles southeast of Carlisle is Croglan Water, a lonely Cumberland stream. Wordsworth's poem establishes its setting. Down from the Pennine Alps, how fiercely sweeps Croglan, the estate of Eden's tributary. However, investigations into whether there is a Croglan Grange reveal that there is no house by that name, only a scatter of lonely farmhouses, of which one, Croglan Low Hall, is the main contender for the title. Parish records and gravestones reveal that the Fishers were the local landowners and farmers, certainly as far back as the 1730s. It is possible that Captain Fisher could have been the grandson of Edward Fisher and his wife Deborah, whose memorials stand in an unstable graveyard. The Bramley Parish records suggest that there were no Fishers at Thorncombe before the captain moved there, so his suggestion that his family went south many generations earlier is misleading. Equally misleading is his description of Croglan Grange's veranda, lawns, and elegant trees. The heavy granite walls of Croglan Low Hall and the barren landscape that surrounds the building certainly do not spell elegance, and there are neither lawns nor verandas. The cobbled yard suggests the hall was a working farm. There are other discrepancies too. Either Fisher or Hare was wrong about the churchyard. There is a church at Croglan, a Victorian building on the site of a Norman church. It is, however, almost 2 miles from Croglan Low Hall, high on a hill above Croglan Water, a prodigious run for the healthiest vampire. At this point, we have to face the facts. The Croglan Grange of the story retold by Hare is not the Croglan that exists in Cumberland. It may be that Hare invented details to enhance a sketchy description given by Fisher, or that the captain, not wishing his aristocratic friends to know he came from humble farming stock, deliberately misled the assembled company to gain his family a more stately origin. Oddly, Hare's description of the Grange matches the Thorncombe estate, Fisher's home in Surrey, in many respects. Allowing then that Hare got his geography and dates wrong, the existence of the 3 tenants and their uninvited summer visitor is still to be substantiated. The letting of the Grange to the anonymous tenants would certainly appear to be a fiction. But where did Fisher find his vampire? A romantic fiction. The present author believes it is necessary to look no further than the work of James Malcolm Rymer, Reimer was a writer of extremely successful penny dreadfuls. In 1847, Varney the Vampire, or The Feast of Blood, a romance in 220 chapters, made its first appearance. In 1853, its 868 pages were reprinted in penny parts. They were to capture the public's imagination, inspiring ballads, songs, and theatrical melodrama. Varney was not quite the first of the genre. In 1816, the storytelling sessions that inspired Mary Shelley's Frankenstein had also given birth to John Plordy's The Vampire, a short story published 3 years later. There were no vampire tales in Britain prior to this date, despite the European vampire epidemic of the 1700s. Although the story of Varney is well known, the text virtually disappeared until it was republished in America in 1974. And it must be supposed that earlier writers overlooked the strange similarities between Varney and the Croglin vampire. Let us compare the two vampires' first appearance. Okay. Fisher sets his action in a ground floor bedroom of a country house on a hot summer's night. Reimer's location is a medieval chamber in a city during a hailstorm. Both rooms have large fastened windows. Fisher's heroine is awake, watching a shadowy figure on the lawn. Reimer's girl sleeps through the storm, but wakes to the sound of fingernails drumming on the glass. She thinks it is the sound of hailstones until she sees a figure standing on her window ledge. Fisher's girl is horrified by scratching and picking at her window. Varney breaks a small pane of glass, and the Croglin vampire picks the lead from around a small diamond pane to gain entry. Both vampires slip in bony fingers to release their catches and open their window. We recall now that Fisher's vampire twisted its long bony hands into the girl's hair, dragging her to the side of the bed so it could bite her throat. What of Varney's technique? This is Reimer's version. The figure seized the long tresses of her hair and twining them around his bony hands. He drags her head to the bed's edge. He forces it back by the long hair, still entwined in his grasp. With a plunge, he seizes her neck in his fang-like teeth. A gush of blood and a hideous sucking noise follows. As long ago as 1929, Montague Summers quoted both texts in The Vampire in Europe, but failed to comment on the curious similarities. He must have noted them, but preferred not to lay Croglin's ghost. The last known owners of Croglin Low Hall reported the ghost of a pig, but rejected the vampire story absolutely. It may seem heartless to deny England her only vampire, but it seems its origin lay not in Cumberland, but in the pages of Reimer's book. Hey, would you look at the time? Looks like we're woefully out of time. Hope you liked the vampire stories. It was kind of unique, I guess. Thanks for listening. I really appreciate you. Thanks to the crew at Nighthawk Radio. If you've got a true scary story and you'd like to be a guest on the show, send an email to indarkplacespod@hotmail.com. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time. God bless.